The legal team of the Honorable Hannah Dugan, the judge who was indicted by Trump's DOJ, has just laid the groundwork for how to get back at an authoritarian regime, how to stand up and resist for an unlawful indictment. My name is Dina Doll with the MeidasTouch Network. Let's break this down. Now, this 37-page motion in support of her motion to dismiss cites Trump's Supreme Court immunity decision, a scathing and really well-written rebuke for why the indictment of her is unlawful. And we see in real time these authoritarian actions by Trump, obviously indicting a sitting state court judge, doing what she is supposed to be doing in her courtroom. We're not talking about some action she took outside of her courtroom with certain people or parties. We're talking about things she did while she was in her robe, in the courtroom. In our justice system, judges are almost like the king of their courtrooms, right? They have so much control and power over what people say and do in their courtrooms. And it was while she was there in her robe, those actions, those most core judicial actions that are the subject of this federal indictment, going to the very heart of the separation of powers in our justice system, and her lawyers bringing it right back to this argument and bringing it right to the Supreme Court, where this may very well likely go, saying, hey, Supreme Court, you just recognize immunity for the president, for this co-equal branch of government. How is he then able to pierce through our immunity? So really strong argument and a roadmap for how you stop the authoritarian actions by Trump. Because sure, it seems like Trump, the Stephen Millers, have a lot of control, but they don't control all of the thousands of judges in our courtrooms and in our cases, which is why this judge's decision ends up becoming more important even than the indictment, because this judge now has power over whether or not the indictment continues. Trump may be able to control the DOJ to bring the indictment, but the judge can stop it. And let's say the judge doesn't. She is still entitled to a jury trial. Trump does not control, Stephen Miller does not control those 12 jurors seated in this trial. I mean, certainly Trump tried to control the jurors seated in his trial, and we see how well that went since he's a 34 fraud convicted felon. And it is that little details that may seem mundane, things that people honestly don't even want to do jury duty most of the time. And we always talk about how it's a civic right, it's a civic duty, and now you see why it is. Because the way you stop authoritarian regimes is giving control to a lot of people. And we have done that with our jury system. Our founders thought of that. They saw what happened when you have too much control to just the judges in the robes, and they gave it to the everyday American people. And that's the resiliency in our democracy. And Trump and Stephen Miller know that. And I'm going to just go into a little bit more about what the motion is, but I think it's really important to discuss it in context of also what we're seeing with Trump and Stephen Miller talking about Leonard Leo in the Federalist Society, because a lot of our judges were hand-selected by Leonard Leo on the Supreme Court and throughout our country. They're very conservative, very extreme. Most of us really don't like them, but Trump and Stephen Miller are going after them because they're not doing his bidding. He sees the resiliency in our democracy is by the diffusion, let's say, of power among all of these judges that he cannot control. And that is why he is going after them. Just take a listen to what Stephen Miller is saying.
That's democracy. So if there's 15 communist crazy judges on the court, that each of them as a team working together can block and freeze each and every executive action. Joe Biden was allowed by that same court system.
Some of them are Trump judges,
20 million
though.
illegal foreigners.
Why did Trump put these crazy communist judges, as you call them, on the bench?
You heard President Trump himself say that the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo has created a broken system for judicial vetting. And God knows this time around, we are not going to be using.
So does that mean he doesn't support picking Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court?
What it means is simply this and nothing more. We're not going to be using the Federal Society to make judicial nominations at all going forward. But let me tell you about these rogue judges. This is the most litigated issue over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, whether or not to deport the foreigners who invaded our country illegally. That is the most litigated issue.
So their next step may be somehow trying to replace judges en masse. I don't see how that's actually possible, but we see them taking that next step because they realize they don't have as much power as they want. Now, Judge Dugan's lawyers, in their memo, starting out, asking this judge, really telling this judge why that this indictment is unlawful and should be dismissed. Quoting, "This is an extraordinary prosecution that poses a threat to federalism and judicial independence. In practical terms of American governmental design, consider starkly what it proposes. One morning, plainclothes federal agents with badges and baseball caps on a bench outside a state courtroom decided how they wanted a judge to control that courtroom and the people in it and near it. For not doing as they wished, the judge faces federal criminal charges." That is the core of the indictment and the core of how much power our judges have in this courtroom. This isn't just about like a scuffle with a Wisconsin judge. This goes to the core of how much power our judges have, this diffusion of power that is the resiliency in our democracy. Because the motion points out the fact, in a motion to dismiss, you kind of have to assume the facts and evidence. Because if there's a dispute in the facts, then it has to go to trial. So the motion says, we are going to assume everything the government says is true. All the facts are true. We're just for this purpose, for this motion. It is still unlawful and should be dismissed based on the law. And so they're saying, we're going to assume it's true that these ICE agents, the judge told the ICE agents to go to the chief judge. The judge, Dugan, was in session, right? In session, telling these ICE agents to go to the chief judge. We're going to assume it's true that I continued my criminal proceedings against this defendant that they were trying to arrest. And maybe I did it off the record, but I continued it. And we're going to assume it's true that this defendant went out a separate door in the courtroom, still leading to the same public hallway that they would have gone out in the other door in my courtroom. We're assuming all of that is true. But I, as a judge, this motion says, have the right to control my courtroom. I, as a judge, can tell somebody to take off their hat and if not, put them in jail. I, as a judge, can even tell a defendant who is sitting in a criminal trial that they have to leave the courtroom and see and watch the evidence against them, with a camera in another courtroom because they're too disruptive. I, as a judge, can order the marshals to get people off the street to come in as jurors if we don't have enough jurors. This is the extent of the power I have to run my courtroom as I want. And this is all this is. The federal government is telling me I can't run the courtroom as I want. I was literally in the middle of a criminal proceeding in my robe doing my duty. And that I cannot be criminally prosecuted for. That I have judicial immunity because it is a core function. And she cites two basic doctrines. One, just basic judicial immunity that has been around since the 1600s in England. We have had it in the colonies that doing official functions as a judge, I have immunity unless I am violating somebody's civil rights, because the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, said that if I'm violating somebody's civil rights, then I can be criminally prosecuted. There are no civil rights for these ICE agents. That doesn't apply. She puts that aside. And then she says the 10th Amendment says that states have the rights that haven't been allocated to the federal government. So our separation of federalism versus states' rights, a federal government cannot tell a state judge how to run their courtroom. And then this is the best part. The memo cites the Trump decision from the Supreme Court that literally just said that the president has Article 2 conduct The basic core conduct that's only given to the president under Article 2 cannot be questioned by Congress, is not subject to Congress, so therefore cannot be criminally prosecuted, and all other official conduct has a presumption that it not be criminally prosecuted. And hey, Supreme Court, my governing of my courtroom is certainly an official core conduct that deserves immunity under that Trump decision. And if not, even a presumption of immunity, falling squarely into the Supreme Court precedent that was just set. And if this, this can certainly be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. We may very well see it, because this is, again, about, we are in this moment in time, the Supreme Court fleshing out, for better or for worse, what kind of immunity, what kind of power the different branches of government have. And this is the central question of Judge Dugan's indictment and of her defense. And we see, I think the Supreme Court in part gave Trump so much immunity because Chief Justice Roberts wanted that immunity for the Supreme Court. They didn't like that Congress was starting to oversee their ethics, that they wanted to try to expand the court, and they wanted to be able to give each branch of government a level of immunity that cannot be touched. And if that is true, then certainly this indictment should be dismissed. And this may give, if this goes to the Supreme Court, this might give the Supreme Court a chance to perhaps narrow what they just said, or at least stand behind the judges around the country who are under attack by this authoritarian regime. But make no mistake, there is a limit to what Trump can do. He knows this. Stephen Miller knows this. That's why they're going out in the press. And in this memo, Judge Dugan is showing us the resiliency of our democracy, because the power of the judges, the power of the people as jurors cannot be fully controlled by Trump. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed to the MeidasTouch channel. There are going to be many developments in this case and others, and that way you can stay updated.
Love this video? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch and help us blow past 1 million followers.